Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. As Ukraine and Russia recently held their first direct talks in 3 years in Istanbul, US President Donald Trump prepares for high-stakes phone calls with Presidents Putin and Zelenskyy. With tensions high and hopes for a ceasefire uncertain, we explore the implications of this diplomatic push and Trump's offer to personally mediate on the future of the war. Joining us to explore the possibilities is Professor Scott Lucas from University College Dublin, an expert in international affairs and US foreign policy. Professor, welcome back to TVP World. Good to have you again.
And thank you so much, and thanks to all your viewers.
Okay, so let's start with the talks that were held in Istanbul. What do you make of the fact that they were held and what the outcomes were of those talks?
Well, let's start with a fundamental, and that is there was never any chance of a significant advance in these talks in Istanbul in terms of a ceasefire or in terms of getting both sides to move closer to an end to the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion, after almost 39 months. The reason why was because the Kremlin was going to pursue, even with that lower level delegation, their maximum demands. Indeed, at the negotiations, they issued the ultimatum, according to Russian officials, that if Ukraine did not give over all of 4 regions, 2 in the east, 2 in the south, as well as Crimea to Russia, then the Russians, the next time talks would demand 6. They would include Kharkiv and the Sumy regions in the northeast. Okay, so why were the talks held if the Russians were not serious about making any movement? They were part of this diplomatic maneuvering, in that you might recall that Vladimir Putin called for direct talks with Ukraine because he was put on the defensive over Ukraine and Europe, putting forth the initiative for a 30-day ceasefire. Now, of course, Putin doesn't want a ceasefire, so he says, oh, well, Ukraine, you talk to us. Well, Vladimir Zelenskyy called Putin's bluff. He said, look, I'll meet you in Istanbul. And of course, when Zelenskyy did that, Putin actually retreated and said, oh, no. We have to have preparations before I'll talk to you. Then he sent Vladimir Medinsky, the person who led the Russian delegation in spring 2022 in Istanbul. He stayed home. So did the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. So in other words, there was a lot of posturing going on apart from the agreement for a 1,000 for 1,000 exchange of POWs. But what's the wider picture here? The wider picture has been that Ukraine and Europe have gotten themselves back to the table. They've gotten beyond the direct U.S.-Russian talks. They've done that with the proposal for the 30-day ceasefire. And I think more importantly, they've done that with the discussions of, all right, how is Ukraine's security, how is its government going to be supported in the longer term? In other words, we've got to be realistic here. This Russian invasion is not going to end. So the discussions have to move to what is a genuine European commitment to keep the government in place, what's a genuine European commitment for air defenses, what's a genuine European commitment to help Ukraine on the front lines when you've got an unpredictable and arguably unstable Trump administration.
Now, there seems to be a dissonance, well, there is a dissonance, isn't there, between Putin saying that he wants peace talks and at the same time doubling down on his aggression inside Ukraine. What is his long-term play here? And what can Europe do short of putting boots on the ground and getting involved in some kind of kinetic action?
Well, look, you folks in Poland know the Kremlin playbook. Known it for many years in terms of that Putin will always say for public consumption, oh, yes, I'm men of peace, let's talk. But you know that Putin always does that in terms of let's talk on Russia's terms. And Russia's terms were actually restated by Foreign Minister Lavrov. They were restated by the head of the team in Istanbul, Vladimir Medinsky. They were stated by the ex-president, Dmitry Medvedev, which is that Ukraine has to capitulate. Ukraine has to give up at least 25% of its territory. It has to be demilitarized and neutral, in other words, weakened, with no significant security guarantees from the West before Russia's going to stop the invasion. So we know all that. So what do you do in that situation? I think what Europe is actually looking to do is to step up the sanctions on Russia, and they need to be stepped up in a meaningful way. It can't just be increased sanctions on Russia's tankers moving oil. Those are already in place, although they need to be enforced. It also needs to be this full cutoff of Russian gas to Europe, which the European Commission has proposed by 2027. It has to be tightening down on the Russian assets, where if you don't confiscate the assets, you at least make clear that the profits from those assets are used now for financial and military support for Ukraine. It has to be Europe doing this as part of an international initiative. In other words, working with other countries to sanction the Russians, to isolate them. And it has to be Europe continuing to work with those adults who are in the room. And there are some in the Trump administration, notably the envoy Keith Kellogg, to say, look, we need you on our side here supporting Ukraine rather than being held hostage to Donald Trump's latest thought bubbles.
Right. So heavier sanctions, understood. I mean, but those have been mooted and are on the verge of being implemented. There are 200 new Russians on the sanctions list. But they're not having much luck at stopping ships carrying oil and gas or perhaps something else heading towards Russia. There was a ship which didn't allow boarding and it didn't stop despite Estonia's efforts to stop it from making that journey to Russia. So how easy is it to implement those sanctions?
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy to intercept and then hold a ship. And you quite rightly mentioned the Russian ship that was pursued because of the suspicion that it was trying to cut or interfere with undersea cables. But just putting, the message out there that you will go after the tankers, that you will crack down on Russian oil exports does have an effect. Russian oil exports are down quite significantly, probably around even between the area of 30 to 40%. In some cases. And of course, the global oil price has been dropping significantly. I think personally that there should be a look by the international community to drop the cap on Russian oil from $60 per barrel down to around about 50, given that drop in oil prices. But beyond that, let's also talk what Europe needs to do in terms of not only supporting those air defenses. I think there has to be a serious look at other types of weaponry going to Ukraine. And here, I think there's been a disappointing development in that we thought that Germany were going to bring in, under the new government of Friedrich Merz, the possibility of the long-range Taurus missiles, which could be used to supplement the Ukrainian strikes on vital Russian facilities. Merz is stepping back from that. Not quite sure why yet. We can discuss that in another program. But the fact here is that you need to ramp up the artillery shells, which are going to the front line. That is being done. You need to step up support for Ukraine's drone manufacturing facilities and other defense production, especially in the west of the country. That is being done. But you do need to actually be able to take the fight to Russia. And that's where Europe is lacking just a bit.
Understood. Now, let's go to President Trump. He did reach out to Putin and say that he would attend the Istanbul peace talks if Putin would. But, of course, as Putin didn't, neither did President Trump. He's reached out again, saying that he will speak to both Putin and Zelenskyy. What can he say to them that could move the needle on the peace process?
Well, first of all, let's be careful. I mean, Donald Trump is actually... he's told falsehoods in the past that he's actually spoken to Vladimir Putin. He did that on a few occasions. So whether or not he actually calls Putin on Monday, we'll see. Now, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, says preparations are underway for a call, but without giving a date. But let's assume the call takes place on Monday and that Trump then says he'll call Zelenskyy. It's not a question of what Trump will get from the Russians. It's a question of whether the Russians can get anything from Trump. Your viewers will know the history of the Russians playing Trump, actually supporting Trump all the way back to the 2016 presidential campaign. Here, I think our assumption has been for months that the Russians could get Trump to support their maximum demands. But two things have happened here. First year, Trump is just simply so unpredictable, so chaotic. He swings back and forth. And while most of the time he blames Zelenskyy for Russia's invasion, he has actually expressed discontent with Putin, especially after Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukraine. And because he's done that, that's opened up space for some Trump advisors and for some Republicans, including in Congress, to say, look, you can't just simply back Vladimir Putin here. You can't be in his pocket. So I don't think Trump will completely roll over to Putin. But secondly, I think the Russians have mishandled this. I think they've mishandled this for months because they've gone for the maximum demands. They've insisted on taking all of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and having the U.S. accept that and indeed endorse it. They've insisted on the lifting of all sanctions on Russia before ending their invasion, and they've continued their missile and drone attacks, and they've come out looking like the bad guys. And I think that has irritated Trump. So I think if the Russians want anything out of Trump, they've got to give something. They've got to give at least a token concession on what Ukraine can get. And I'm not sure what that would be at this point.
Do you think it's likely?
No, I don't. I honestly don't. I still think the Russians think they can manipulate Trump into supporting what they're going to call the annexation of those areas of Ukraine. I still think they can manipulate Trump into thinking they can split Ukraine not only from NATO, but split it from meaningful Western support for years. And I think what the Russians are overlooking is it's not just Trump, it is a Trump administration. And while there are people in that Trump administration who are Kremlin friendly, like the envoy to Russia, Steve Witkoff, there are others who are not. And again, I don't think the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, wants to be in the position of just simply supporting Vladimir Putin all out. I don't think Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, does. And I also think the one thing that if you watch from this past week, the one person who was in Istanbul near the talks, or at least in Turkey, was the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, a friend of Trump,
right,
who actually is a very big supporter now of backing Ukraine. If Graham and other Republican senators put pressure on Trump, that also limits how much he can give in to Putin.
Understood. In the last few seconds that we have left, Professor, just very quickly. Now, of course, the US and Ukraine have signed a deal on rare earth metals extraction in Ukraine. If you put that in the mix, do you think that's going to shift the attitude that the US has towards Russia claiming all this land in Ukraine? Just very quickly, please.
It makes a difference because even though the rare earth minerals can't be developed for years, if you're going to try to develop them, you have to protect the personnel who are there from Russian attacks, which means not only do you have to recognize the territory as Ukrainian, you have to provide some sort of, if not security guarantee, security measures for those folks. So yes, it does involve the U.S. to an extent.
Understood. Well, thank you very much for laying all of that out for us, Professor, and have a good day, sir.
Very best to you. Very best to Ukraine.
Bye-bye now. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.